But I think the comment you made about the Latin American priests not being allowed to, licenses being removed, we've seen that happening in Uganda as well with one of the Anglican priests there. And indeed, the challenge to the Anglican Church has been quite a huge one. But we've also seen work being done to try and bridge that gap, utilizing theology as well. So there is hope on the horizon, I would say. Judge Cameron, the question was, and it was phrased slightly differently, but it's the same question, what do you think the LGBTI activists should themselves be doing to work in alliance with your sector?
Well, I'm going to go around in a circle, really, Alice, because I think that I just want to comment something on what the bishop said, if I may. And the bishop's got a beautiful name because it means shepherd, and it's very lovely to me that you play that role in our society, and you do so, if I may say, if you don't mind me, on issues of institutional integrity, on corruption, on justice, on fairness, and I want to pay tribute to you for that, Bishop. May I?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's not easy. Thank you. It's the council that the bishop heads has been a voice of truth consistently through our transition. It was a voice of truth under apartheid, and under the bishop and under his predecessor, Reverend Chikani, it hasn't changed. And I think that has required a courageous shift, which to remain the voice of truth. But thank you, Bishop. So can I get back to what I was saying? And I wanted to say about what the bishop said. I think part of the reason why there hasn't been a flowering of LGBTI and transgender activists who are challenging the traditional theologies is that, on the one hand, many LGBTI people have been so enraged and so discouraged and so alienated by the church that they've just given up completely. And on the other hand, I do think also that there's been that the rise of LGBTI pride, which I see as very analogous to the rise of black pride and the assertion from within also, the problems of interior disablement, which Steve Biko addressed, are also problems that we face in our sector, that you think maybe we really are abnormal. But the rise of the assertiveness of that pride has coincided with such a mass secularization in the world. So I think that those might be two of the reasons why there hasn't yet been a theology of LGBTI and transgender equality. But Alice, to get back to your question, because I've taken a lot of liberty with the time you're giving me the podium, I go back to what I said. I think it's a joint partnership. I think it's visibility. I think that we have to be challenged. I have to be challenged about transgender issues. I think a lot of people in the LGBTI sector, especially self-identifying gays and self-identifying lesbians, are transphobic. And I think we have to be challenged. We have to understand that our call to understand humanity in different ways applies also to ourselves, and that the challenge never stops. So I would say visibility and consistent challenge. I think that the other foundation is premised on the alliance that I mentioned earlier between activism, between community mobilization, civil society activism, and legal methods. In South Africa, we saw a tremendous success. The court in which I now sit, the Constitutional Court, which is South Africa's highest court, has given no fewer than 6 judgments on LGBTI equality. And that was because the LGBTI sector was so activist and was so strategic and was so well organized. And that must continue, not only within the sector, but within many other sectors in which there's still injustice. But I would say that should continue. Thank you for giving me leeway, Alice. I must say you've got a lawyer and a theologian and a journalist. So it's amazing we give each other any chance. It's only the HR person who knows how to. No.
I think,
I can't speak for this media house because I'm not here representing all of the media. But I think following the ANC Women's League conference and its position on trans people and membership to the league, there was a newspaper that tried to communicate that story and did it very poorly. The Sowetan did it poorly, reinforced a whole lot of stereotypes. In fact, I think it was a very real reflection of what happens in our newsrooms every day. Yeah. And the organization in question that was misrepresented responded immediately. But there was a muted silence from the LGBTI community. People didn't challenge the newspaper. In fact, up until this day, I think on social media, there was a challenge thrown out to the editor to apologize for the way in which that story was framed, headlined, and presented. But there was no outcry. There was no pushback for a retraction. If that misrepresentation in that newspaper had happened, let's say, on race or even on gender, for that matter, the response would have been completely different. So my advice to the LGBTI community is to be vocal and to use your power and the space that we have in South Africa to contest, especially the media. I think, you know, there is this tendency to kind of almost sabotage ourselves. A lot of people, when they operate in professional spaces, are not always comfortable, enabled, empowered, free enough to arrive in their authentic selves at work. I think journalism, unlike many other professions, have a bit more leeway where people are more able to come and turn up in their authentic selves. But that doesn't mean that that gets translated into a progressive narrative around news and what information is. I mean, the sexism, the racism, the homophobia, the kind of ways in which media is often manipulated by mainstream media is, you know, there's so many examples. I mean, one can kind of go on forever. What I'm keen on is that every group who feels aggrieved or feels that they've been misrepresented normally speak up. There are two groups in South Africa that generally don't speak up, I think, as much as they can and should. It's people who use the roads. If you live in South Africa, you know that roads in South Africa is a death trap. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that no one speaks up for the thousands of people who die on the roads every single day in South Africa. And I've always asked myself, what kind of activism will it require for people to speak on that matter? Because you can literally get into a taxi in the morning, an able-bodied, fit, healthy individual, and you can come home a paraplegic, and no one will fight for you. And then the other group is the LGBTI community that I think needs to become more vocal. But I think what this panel for me is about is how you get there. And one of the things in my other life, before I became a journalist, I was also an activist. And I think one of the things that we learned was to organize with people where they were at. So if you were in the church, you organized people there. If you were a nurse, you organized yourself there. If you were a student, you organized yourself there. If you were unemployed, you were organized in your community. And I think that is what the LGBT community needs to do, is to locate the struggles of that community firmly within that circle of human rights issues and begin to form those alliances with people across the board. I'm not a religious person now, but I come from a very conservative Muslim family. One of the things that's really interesting in that community now is the fact that they are finally talking about gay people, never mind all the other things that are happening within the LGBTI community. But suddenly there's a place where Muslims who are gay and lesbian can go and worship. When I was growing up, there were no such options. And if they were incredibly closed, underground, you know, very kind of secretive and so on. So I think democratization in South Africa should be an ally. And the space should be used to generate and galvanize people wherever they find themselves. So if you can organize the corporates to back the rights of LGBTs, if you can engage the media around things like language and the way in which stories are framed, then go for it. I think sometimes we don't have enough appreciation for the kinds of freedoms we actually have. And we should take them, and we should push the boundaries all the time.
Thank you. You answered a follow-up question I was going to ask you about how those of us not living in a South Africa, with the kind of constitutional protections which you do have, which have provided an environment for civil society, for LGBTI activists to engage directly with the media, to be able to do what they do, which suggestions you'd give. But I mean, you've sort of covered those.
I think if one looks at like an African context, and in some places where things are a lot more repressive, I mean, I am very fascinated by the changes post the fall of the Soviet Union. And the two things that interest me about many of the former Soviet republics, it's the erosion of rights for women, and a whole lot of social care things that went with that, things like being able to bring your child to work, having a safe place for the child to be educated and so on. Reproductive rights in a place like Poland. All of those things have been rolled back, and yet those countries are, you know, characterized in media and information terms as free societies, as engaging societies. And I think there's a lot of, like I said, contestation that needs to continue to happen. I think even in repressed communities, I think one of the lessons for me as a South African who grew up in the 80s and as a young person who had to make a choice about what to do then, I think the big issue is to organize people at the point where they are. I think it's, for me, broad front politics is really powerful. Organizing people around a minimum set of agreements is, you know, there's this tendency, I think, sometimes to want all your ducks in a row before you put one foot forward. It's very disempowering. It's important to always look at what minimum platform can you put together to push on issues of rights for people. And I think increasingly that is, at a tactical and at a strategic level, that is what the LGBTI community needs to be looking at. And choose your allies, you know, wisely and based on being able to advance the rights of other people, you know, as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Over to you.
From my standpoint, in a corporate context, I've found quite a jarring invisibility from activists in the LGBTI sector within corporate spaces. And it's easy to even assume, certainly from where I sit, that there's a strong anti-business sentiment, which is alienating when we are LGBTI people working in business. So who are we? Where do we belong? Where do we get our representation from? Who do we talk to? I had a couple of friends / colleagues who operate in these consulting space and wanted to do work. And they didn't get the work. I didn't give them